everybody, I'm Wayne,
Hey, I'm Katie.
and this is the Wayne and Kate Show. Welcome to the last session of Purity Matters. We've been building up to this for quite some time, and so today's session deals with sexual purity. Now, we've been careful to say ever since the beginning of this study that when you're talking about purity, it's not necessarily just about sex. I feel like that's one of the mistakes we've made in the past when talking to teenagers about abstinence and things like that, is that we focus on just, abstaining from sexuality, and it doesn't get to the heart of the issue, because we said at the very beginning of this whole thing that if purity doesn't matter to you, then purity will not happen. And so it's really a heart issue. And so you will not be a sexually pure person if you don't have a pure heart and a pure mind before God. If you don't desire purity, you will not be sexually pure. So where have we been? We've talked about the fact that if purity doesn't matter to you, it won't happen. We've talked about guarding your gates. Mm-hmm. We've talked about
compromising places,
avoiding compromising situations, dealing with sin. We've kind of been all around the issue.
And pure thoughts. We talked about pure thoughts last week.
And so that gets us all the way to this point where we're talking about sexual purity. Sexual purity honors God and it protects you. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, it doesn't take much to look around and realize that we live in a sex-saturated culture. Whether it is TV or it is movies or it is just school, or I was surprised by some of the things I heard last night with the youth, or it is just a hamburger commercial. Mm-hmm. For some reason, sexuality is part of everything that goes on in our culture, and we might be tempted to think that this is something that is purely American, or something that's kind of new on the arrival of world history. But the fact is that sex has always been a problem. And even back in the days of the Roman Empire, it was an incredibly sexualized world that people lived in. And so today, as we talk about sexual purity, we're going to be looking at a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. And the city of Corinth was one of these cities. It was a metropolis in the Roman Empire. And there was unbridled sexuality going on there. In fact, there was a goddess, a Greek goddess of love. Her name was Aphrodite. And they had a temple in Corinth. And in that temple, there were 1,000 sacred prostitutes. And so the way that you worshiped the goddess Aphrodite is you would go to this temple and you would have sex with a temple prostitute. So that was worship for them. So I would say that they were pretty twisted folks, okay? And we may look at that and go, well, we're not as bad as they are because we don't, have some sex god that we worship through having sex. But even though we don't have a sex god, I would say that in our society and our culture, sex has become a god for so many people. It's all they think about. Mm-hmm. It captivates all of their thinking. It's part of everything they do. And for many people, get this, for many people, their sexuality or their sexual preferences actually define who they are as a person. Mm. Now that really gets to the heart of it being someone's God, because for those of us who are believers, our God is the one who defines who we are as individuals. But for so many people, their sexuality defines who they are as an individual.
Becomes their God. And
so sex is their God, okay? So we talked to our students last night about some of the things that they hear at school, what they talk about at home, and I shared some statistics with them, and these statistics are actually pretty old, but this statistic says that 2.6 million teens become sexually active each year. That's 7,000 a day. Around half of all high schoolers said they'd been sexually active in the past, while 1/3 are currently active. And so these statistics point to the fact that we as Christian adults and as Christian parents can't afford to be silent on the issue of sexuality. This is an area that we need to be speaking into. It's an area that we need to be influencing our students and our children on. And so that's why we need to have these kinds of conversations. Now, it would be tempting for us to think that the individuals who are committed to sexual purity are few and far between. But the truth is, there are quite a lot of people are committed to abstinence and committed to sexual purity. And they're just kind of the silent crowd. The folks who are tearing it up sexually, they're talking about it. They're out there. But
it's something that they flaunt.
It's something they flaunt, something they're proud of. But the ones who are keeping themselves pure and abstaining, they don't talk about it very much, but they are there. And so that ought to be an encouraging thing, that we're not alone. There are people who feel like us, who believe like us, and who are willing to make the same commitments as us. So the question that we're going to answer in this session is, why should I keep my body sexually pure? And we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be looking at Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It's 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 14 is the first section of that we're going to look at. But the answer to the question, why should I keep my body sexually pure? Well, first of all, because sex isn't everything. We live in a culture where we're led to believe that maybe sex is everything. Every romance novel drives towards it. Women's value are defined by it. Men's masculinity is determined by it. But sexuality, regardless of what society tries to tell us, sexuality is not everything. Look at what Paul says. He says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is helpful. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be brought under the control of anything. Food's for the stomach, and the stomach for foods, but God will do away with both of them. The body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now, what Paul is referencing here is there was a saying in the day, food's for the stomach and stomach's for food. In other words, your stomach is made for food, so you should enjoy food. You should indulge in food because that's what it's made for. And evidently there were some folks who were making the same statements about the human body. Well, the human body is made for sexuality, so you should enjoy sex. You should engage in sex. You should indulge in it, and because that's what your body's made for. And Paul is very clearly saying your body is not made for sexual immorality, but especially if you're a believer, your body is made for the Lord. Okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with sex as long as it's like everything else in life. There's nothing wrong with eating unless you become a glutton. You use it outside of the boundaries. There's nothing wrong with there's a lot of things in life. There's nothing wrong with them in moderation or when used in the proper boundaries. And sex is the same way. Inside of a marriage, it's a good thing. But when you take it outside of marriage, you have created a problem, and that is what Paul's saying. Your body is not for that. As a believer, your body is for God. And so when you are using it for sexual immorality, you are using it for something that it was never intended for. The term immorality comes from the Greek word porneia, and many of you, that word sounds familiar. It's where we get the word pornography from. And so this doesn't just apply, that when he's talking about sexual immorality, that doesn't just apply to sex. It applies to any sexual behavior that is outside of the marriage, outside of a proper relationship between a husband and a wife. And so this could apply to pornography. This could apply to a whole host of issues which we won't go into on YouTube, but it's not just sex. It's any kind of sexual immorality. So when you engage in sexual immorality with another individual, you are basically giving your body over to them, and your body is not yours to give, especially if you are a believer. All right? So, sex isn't everything. Okay? It's we don't live for sex. It's just something that's part of life. All right? So that's the first reason we should keep our body sexually pure. The second reason why should I keep my body sexually pure is because if you are involved, Jesus is involved. Look at what he goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 6:15 through 17. He says, "Do you not know that your bodies are the members of Christ? So should I take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Absolutely not. Do you not know that anyone joined to a prostitute is one body with her? For it says, the two will become one flesh. But anyone joined to the Lord is one spirit with him." So Paul, again, is reminding us that we don't belong to ourselves. And not only that, but when we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, God's Spirit comes to dwell inside of us. And so if God's Spirit is in you, then anything that you do, anywhere you go, you drag God along with you. So if you're involved in sexual immorality, you're dragging him into your sin. So if you're involved, Jesus is involved. Okay? The other issue that Paul brings up here is that sexuality is unlike really anything else in the world, because when you have sex with another individual, you are joining yourself to that person. He uses the terminology that the two becomes one flesh, and we get that picture when God brought Eve to Adam, that they were to complete and complement one another, and the two would become one. And we see Jesus talk about the same thing in the New Testament when he's talking about the divorce, that what God has joined together, no man is to tear apart. And so the idea here is that when you, unlike anything else you do, when you have sex with another person, you are joining yourself to that person, and the two of you become one flesh. Now, that is a real problem for a lot of people.
I think it's a real problem for my generation specifically, because the generation that I'm growing up in is all about hookups, casual sex here and there, whoever, get
Friends
up the next morning,
leave
like nothing happened. Exactly. That the idea that, sex binds you is something that my generation doesn't understand.
And I think we've so devalued sexuality, so removed the intimacy of it, so destroyed its relational aspect, that we look at people like they're animals, and they're just doing it, and then they go on about their business, and there's nothing that's happened there. But spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, psychologically speaking, physically speaking, there's a lot more going on there than you can possibly comprehend. It's the way God designed it. And it doesn't matter if you don't like the design. You're not the designer. So you don't get to just decide how something is used just because you don't like the way the designer intended it to be used, okay? The fact is, God has designed sex to be the glue of sorts in a marriage. And so when you have sex with your spouse, the two of you are drawn closer together. You become one with one another. And when we try to do that with, other people, and then things don't work out, or we move on to another relationship,
or it's just a hookup.
Yeah, what you end up with is here you're connected to this person, and then you might go be connected to another person. You might get, and so what we told the students is last night, these folks who do this wonder why when they get married and they have sex with their married husband or wife, they're constantly thinking about these other people they've been with. And that's an inescapable consequence of doing that. Here's how we illustrated it last night. This picture of purple liquid right here started out as a cup of red water and pink water
blue water
and a cup of blue. Yeah, and so what happens when you pour those together? it becomes purple.
They're combined together.
They're combined. And so the challenge is there any way to separate now the pink from the blue? No. And so just like you can't separate those things out into individual colors again, once you bind yourself to another person sexually, you are forever connected to that person, like it or not. Now that's socially, psychologically, emotionally. People bear scars from relationships for the rest of their lives, people that they have been bound to that they can't unbind themselves from. But it's also physically, because one of the things we talked about last night is just the number of sexual transmitted diseases and things like that. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on chemically when people are having sex. There's transfer of chemicals, not to get too descriptive, but so it's like you are now connected to another person, not just emotionally and psychologically, but physically. You are connected with that other person. Okay, so that should be a real problem for those of us who are blood-bought believers, children of God, because we belong to the Lord. And we can't just go around connecting ourselves with other people at will. We are required as believers to connect as God wills, right? And
within the boundaries of marriage.
Within the boundaries of marriage. So if you're involved, Jesus is involved, and Jesus is with you regardless of what you're watching, what you're reading, or who you're with. All right? So moving on. Why should I keep my body sexually pure? Because sexual sin can mess you up. 1 Corinthians 6:18. Flee from sexual immorality. Every sin a person can commit is outside the body, but the person who is sexually immoral sins against his own body. Now, I don't know how many of you out there like to do crazy things like skydiving or roller coaster riding or bungee jumping or things like that. Do you like to do that stuff?
Maybe roller coasters, but I don't think I could bungee jump.
So you're not much of an adrenaline junkie?
I would skydive.
Okay. I kind of like adrenaline. I'm a little bit of an adrenaline junkie. Not so much that, hey, I'm going to do something crazy that's going to kill me. But
you like roller coasters, and you probably skydive.
I'll do something that's relative that I feel like is
you talked about speeding last week.
Yeah. So, but and you know, the truth is that sex produces some of those same experiences. It's a adrenaline high. It's pleasurable. But here's the deal: of all of those things that we mentioned, unbridled sexuality is actually exponentially more dangerous than any of those things that we talked about. In 2006, about 5,259 youth aged 13 to 24 in 33 states were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. Each year, there are about 19 million new sexually transmitted disease infections, and almost half of those are youth age 15 to 24. So that's 9.5 million new infections every year. And some of those are serious enough to lead to sterility or problems with bearing children later on in life. I know now there's a whole vaccine that's given to teenagers for the HPV virus, and the whole rationale behind that virus is if your child has unprotected sex with somebody who has HPV, they can become a carrier of it, or they can be infected with it, and it can lead to all kinds of cancers and stuff like that. And so now we're vaccinating our children because we have just accepted the idea.
A consequence of when you take sex outside of marriage.
Exactly. In 2002, 12% of all pregnancies occurred among adolescents aged 15 to 19. Again, these are pretty old statistics. I can only assume that now these numbers are higher. What this tells me, though, is 19 million people are 19 million new people are infected every year with sexually transmitted diseases. That means we're walking around in Walmart, we're walking around in the mall, we're walking around with some folks that we may be even brushing elbows with who are carrying this stuff, and you don't even realize it. So then what that means in a hookup culture is that you're playing Russian roulette.
So true. Yeah.
But yet teenagers are told, hey, man, this is the thing to do. It's safe. Go for it. All right? Everybody's doing it. That's what they see on TV, you know? But the truth is, sexual sin can mess you up. That's what Paul says. He says, when you sin sexually, you sin against your own body. So, things get risky when you take something that God created to be between one man and one woman in the confines of marriage, and you take those outside of those confines and you just start playing with it. Okay? Because that's what a lot of people are doing with sex. They're just playing.
It's nothing. It's like, it doesn't mean
It's like
anything.
a game. Yeah. Just a pastime, something to do to have fun. Well, here's another good example of that. You know, this candle right here is hot. You know, a few weeks back, we had some power outages in our area, and in my house, we had a lot of these going to give light. And, you know, this candle, pretty safe, pretty effective, pretty useful within the confines of its container. As long as it's in this little glass container, this candle is pretty safe. It's not going to cause any problems, but it will give me lots of benefits. But what happens when this flame gets outside of the container?
It's going to spread really fast.
Yeah,
it could stuff down.
It could cause some really destructive things to happen when it gets outside of its container. And look, sex is like a flame. Within the confines of marriage, it's safe, it's beneficial, it's good, it's fun. But the moment you take it outside of the container, all of a sudden it becomes dangerous. It becomes something that can destroy you. It becomes something that can lead to all kinds of problems. And so that's the message, though, that, man, our teens need to hear. Not just our teens, adults need to hear that. That the reason that God says, God put it within marriage, and the reason he set those boundaries is not because God doesn't love us. It's not because God wants to keep something good from us. It's not because he doesn't want us to have fun. It's because God is protecting us, because he realizes the destructive power of unbridled sexuality. So sexual sin can mess you up. When you take sex outside of the context for which God designed it, you are playing with fire. Okay? All right, lastly, why should I keep my body sexually pure? Well, because your body is not your body, and we've alluded to that already. If you are a believer, your body does not belong to you. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 20, do you not know that your body is a sanctuary of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. Now, I asked the students last night, I have a red Z71 that I have just taken immaculate care of over the years, and I love my truck. I take good care of it. But I said, and all of these students, they know that. I asked them, I said, you know, what would happen if I loaned my truck to one of you guys and said, hey, treat it the way that I would treat it? And I said, and then I found out later that you've been cutting donuts in the parking lot, you've been racing it down the street, you've been redlining it, you went mud riding in it, you have jumped it over some railroad tracks or something. You know, you've done all this crazy stuff in my truck. Yeah, I mean, I would be furious. And there would be some consequences to that, obviously. One of those being that I'd never let you come near my truck again. But the question that I pose to the students is, when you're borrowing something that belongs to somebody else, how should you treat it?
Better than you would treat it yourself.
Yeah. it's not yours. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to
have more respect for it.
I'm going to have respect for the person who owns it enough to follow their rules and how I use it, right? And so for those of us who are believers, Jesus Christ died on a cross and gave up his life to purchase us. And when we accept salvation, we got this idea in our head that we get salvation as a gift, but we don't have to give anything in return. And that is wrong. That makes you God and makes God a genie. That is not what happens. What happens in salvation is more of a transaction. That's why Romans 10:9 says that you have to confess Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart. Okay? So confessing him as Lord means I'm giving you my heart and my life. You are now my new master. So your life belongs to Jesus. It is now on loan to you. Your body is on loan to you. So when you use that body for things that are destructive, things that are sinful, things that God has explicitly said no to, you are showing a blatant disrespect for God. You are showing a disrespect for what Christ did on the cross. And you are showing, really it shows that you don't really love God that much at all. Because if a person loves me and I let them borrow my vehicle, their love for me is going to make them want to take care of it. Okay? And so if I really love God and I realize that this body, this life is on loan from him, that it ultimately belongs to him, I'm going to respect his wishes for how I ought to live it. Okay? And so the point is, your body is not your body. And that's one of the most important reasons that we should avoid sexual immorality, is because God has laid out the foundations for it. He's laid out the boundaries. And then he's given you your life that you're living. And he said, this is how I want you to live the life that I have given you. And if we love him, then we ought to respect his wishes, because we realize we don't belong to us. So what are some dating principles that we can throw out there for students that will...
And parents, you can enforce this at home. Have these conversations with your kids at home. It'll set some good standards.
Yeah, absolutely. These are, like, if you're going to talk about anything that we've talked about today, these dating principles are really, really good. You need to help your students set boundaries. Remember the conversation we had, was it last week or week before that, where we talked about the mind of a teenager and how in heat of the moment situations,
that was last week. Yeah.
In heat of the moment situations, they're incapable of making life or death type decisions. That's why you need to have these conversations with them. Help them to imagine, if I get caught in this situation, how am I going to react? How am I going to respond? So you help them set those boundaries. So first of all, dating principle number 1, if it's covered or should be covered by clothes, it's off limits. Now we added or should be covered because nowadays
everybody doesn't cover everything that should be
some
covered.
Things that should be covered are not covered. And so if it's covered or should be covered by clothes, it's off limits. And one of the standards I've always said is if it should be covered by a bathing suit, then your hands need to stay away from it. If it should be covered by a bathing suits are getting smaller and smaller.
They are.
But I'm saying if it should be covered by a bathing suit, then your hands should stay away from it. Okay? Number 2, if you can't tell your parents about it, it's off limits. And I wish you could have seen last night when I said that. Some of them were like,
what?
Because there are things that they have that their parents don't know about. And this doesn't just apply to sexuality. This ought to be a good principle across the board. If you're doing anything as a teenager that you would be ashamed if your parents found out about it, that's a pretty good indicator you shouldn't be doing it. All right?
Absolutely.
That's just a matter of character, a matter of integrity. Okay? So if you can't tell your parents about it, it's off limits. Don't do it. If you wouldn't want your future children to do it or find out about it, it's off limits. Now, there's a lot of adults right now that wish they'd have known that principle back when they were teenagers, because now they have kids and they're like, oh, I can't really talk about some of the things I did. You know what I'm saying? So if you wouldn't want your future children to do it, it's off limits. And finally, if it doesn't honor the other person and God, it's off limits. So listen, girls, when you have some boy come up to you, some hormone crazed boy, and he says, if you love me, you will fill in the blank. Your answer to that boy should be, it's precisely because I do love you that I won't.
It's because I have so much respect for you and for myself and for God that I won't. Yeah.
If it doesn't honor the other person and God, it's off limits. Same goes for guys. When you have some girl come up to you, because girls are just as bad nowadays as guys.
Now.
They chase boys just as bad as boys used to chase girls. They may chase them worse.
I think it is worse.
But when you have a girl come up to you and say, if you love me, you'll do this, then your answer ought to be, it's precisely because I do love you that I won't. Mm-hmm. Because I'm going to honor you, even if, get this, I'm going to honor you even if you don't honor yourself. Even if you don't have enough self-worth and self-value to do what is best for you, I'm going to do what's best for you.
That could be the only type of honor that girl has ever been shown in her life. She's obviously acting that way for a reason, so that might be the only bit of respect she gets.
Yeah.
It might speak volumes to her.
So I want to encourage you to, parents, you need to talk about those dating principles with your students. Students, if you're watching this, you need to incorporate those into your lives. I'm a firm believer. I had a seminary professor one time that told our class, he said, make decisions now so that you'll never have to make them again. And his point was, make decisions in a time, think about situations that could come up, make decisions now about how you will handle those so that when you get in that situation, you already have an answer. You're not trying to figure out what is the right thing to do in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so these principles help you to make some decisions now that you won't have to make later. We said, hey, if your parents aren't home, you don't need to be there at all. If with a person of the, well, you could say opposite sex with
anybody.
There's
with anybody that you're attracted to.
Yeah,
there.
Wow. There's no reason for a guy to have a girl in his bedroom, a girl to have a guy in her bedroom. I mean, set some boundaries. And look, if you're committed to not having sex, get this, if you're committed to not having sex, then your boundary does not need to be right at not having sex. Because what's going to happen is you're going to find yourself blowing through that boundary, and then boom, you've made a mistake and it's too late. Your boundary needs to be far enough back from that so that even if you do make a mistake, even if you do blow through that boundary, you're still in a safe zone. So parents, you need to be helping your students set those boundaries. Students, you need to be setting those boundaries for yourself. Parents, you need to set those boundaries for yourself. Mm-hmm. We all need to live by boundaries. So anyway, this has kind of been the culmination of our Purity Matters study. This coming Sunday, we will actually be having a ceremony in our worship service where our students will be making some commitments to purity along with the adults. They'll be making those commitments as well. So I hope that this has been beneficial to you as you've watched this. In a few weeks, we'll be starting a new series on, I believe we're going to call it Liberating Your Life from the Success Syndrome. So we're going to be talking about how to truly be successful as believers, not to buy into a worldly view of success, but to adopt God's view of success. So tune back in a couple weeks, and those we'll start streaming those as well. So you parents and students who might miss will have that information. Anyway, I hope this has been beneficial to you. And if you have any questions or comments, you can put them down below. Subscribe to the channel. Share us.
Yep, share this video.
And tune back in tomorrow. I'll have a quick thought. Katie have a quick thought on Saturday. Been good talking to you. I'm Wayne.
I'm Katie. Thanks for watching.
See ya.